the opportunity to speak with you, and I'm glad to see so many people turned out this afternoon to listen about all these important issues. I'm here representing a group called Save Our Parks, because we believe the proposal by the mayor is in fact has great potential to harm our parks. Who could be against parks? We're not. It's like mom apple pie and the American flag, but there's a lot of important details you need to know about this particular proposal. And as Marion Spencer said in her editorial in the Enquirer, this parks proposal is bad government. And I think it will also lead to the destruction of some of our treasured parks. I'm going to explain that here in a minute. It's bad government because no property tax should be in the city's constitution. That's a poor place, a poor way to do business, to put into the constitution of our city that there has to be this tax forever. And the only way to end that tax in this program is for citizens to circulate petitions. That's not the way things are normally done. Normally, you have tax increases or tax proposals that are for a specific period of time, and then they come back to the voters automatically for reconsideration. So you have a chance to say, well, was this money well spent? Was this a good idea? Is it needed to go forward again? And that's not what's happening here. It's like putting in a constitutional amendment to the United States that says there will be a certain amount of highway funds appropriated every year. It's cluttering our constitution of the city. Now, it's bad government because it creates a special process for capital improvements in parks. Every biennium, the city professional managers come to city council and say, here is our proposal for specific projects, capital improvements of all kinds in the next 2 years. And there are public hearings held about that list of proposed capital improvements. And it comes before council, who has an opportunity to criticize, add to, or delete projects from that capital improvement list. And the mayor has an opportunity to do the same. That process is not in place for the use of these kinds of funds that are proposed by Mayor Cranley. So really the council and the public are cut out of this decision-making process. In fact, it's the mayor who controls what projects will be built with the 75% of this money that's going to be submitted to the voters for approval. And only the park board can only add or delete from that list of projects with the mayor's approval. So it's a completely different process than we have for all other projects. That's why some of us feel that potentially this is a slush fund for the mayor. It goes back to Boss Cox, from 100 years ago. That's why we ended up with the Charter Party and reformance instead. Because the mayor at that time and the political bosses were using your tax money to hand out projects that please their friends. And I think if you look at the list, and I'm sorry we don't have I had a PowerPoint presentation, but the equipment here is being used in another room down the hall. So I can't give you the entire list, but as you see, many of these projects are aimed at specific groups of people and pleasing them. And in fact, many of the projects on the list have nothing whatsoever to do with parks, even though parks are being used as the mom apple pie way of appealing to the voters and getting support. For example, they want to buy and refurbish the King Records building in Evanston. Maybe a worthy project that hasn't got an iota of anything to do with parks. That's something completely different. They want to buy the Jewish Community Center in Roselawn and turn that into the Roselawn Recreation Center. Might be a very fine project, but that's not parks. That's really something that falls in the bailiwick of the Recreation Commission. And a lot of these projects, the mayor says, are intended to stimulate economic activity. What we're creating is a second economic development department. We have an economic development department. The Parks Department should not be deciding what projects are undertaken for purposes of economic development. So we're just messing up the way government was decided it should be and proceeding, I think, in a very harmful way. Now keep in mind, this list of initial projects proposed by the mayor will eat up something like $80 million. $80 million. It only brings in $5 million a year. So what he's going to do is go out and borrow money. And even if the entire $5 million was spent on these projects each year, it would take 5 into 89. it would take a lot of years before you could add another project to this list. So if your community is not on this list of additional projects, it's going to be a long time before you can get added to that list. Now, I want to tell you why I think, as an environmentalist, that these projects that are proposed actually in parks are bad for our parks. And let's take, for example, Burnett Woods and Mount Airy Forest in particular. The mayor says Burnett Woods is underutilized and he wants it to be overhauled. He wants it to be bursting with activity. And when he was asked, what about the trees? How many trees are going to be lost because of your proposed improvements to Burnett Woods? He said, I don't know. That's a design issue. Well, I say to you, that's more than just a trivial matter. That's an extremely important matter. And what's proposed in Burnett Woods is the relocation of some park roads right through forested areas and a restaurant in Burnett Woods that will also take additional trees. And I say to you, Burnett Woods is a very special place. It is one of the earliest designated important birding areas by the Audubon Society because there are over 150 species of birds that regularly come to Burnett Woods. When these trees go, those birds will go too, and we'll lose that important designation. Why does everything have to be a bustling activity, as the mayor suggests? There should be room for preserving nature within our city. So Burnett Woods will be heavily damaged if this is approved. Turning to Mount Airy Forest. Earlier, the mayor said, I want to put in a beer garden in Mount Airy Forest. A beer garden. As if there's no difficulty finding a place to buy a beer in Cincinnati. And where does he propose? Where did he propose to put that beer garden? In the Arboretum, of all places. That's the showcase for plant species, trees and flowers. And I'll grant you, it's not been well maintained. It's been neglected because park resources have gone to other more flashier projects. But if they succeed, even though this beer garden's not on the mayor's list, but there's nothing to stop him from adding it back in. If he succeeds in converting our Arboretum in Mount Airy Forest into a beer garden, and the Arboretum just becomes a backdrop for a beer garden, that's ignoring nature and destroying nature. And unless you happen to have the resources to buy a beer or eat dinner at the restaurant that would also be in the Arboretum, you're being effectively denied access to that project. He proposes to put in a multi-purpose trail circling through Mount Airy Forest. I got to tell you, I've gone through that same loop hundreds of times over the years because I used to live right next to Mount Airy Forest. It's rugged terrain, and you can't put in a paved bicycle path, multi-purpose trail without taking away many trees, without a lot of grading and earth moving. Much of the natural resources of Mount Airy Forest will be lost. I have pictures that I've taken by myself of flocks of wild turkeys in Mount Airy Forest. It's hard to believe, right in the city, and foxes. Those opportunities for habitat will be lost if these projects become a reality. He wants to set aside 100 acres in Mount Airy Forest for a rugged terrain mountain bike trail on some of the steepest property in Mount Airy Forest between West Fork Road and 74, if you're familiar with that. That will heavily damage that environment. And again, this is another example of 100 acres being set aside for a specific group of people. Unless you can afford to buy a $1,000 mountain bike, you're not going to be using that 100 acres of Mount Airy Forest. And this is an unfortunate trend we see in our parks, is that parks are being taken over for private purposes at taxpayer expense. On the way into town today, I live in Over the Rhine. I will usually walk through Washington Park to get here. What I saw today was, and I invite you to go by today, Washington Park is encircled today by a chain link fence 6 feet high with a security guard posted at each entrance to the park. That park today is off limits to the public because it's being used for a private corporate purpose. And looking at the schedule for the month of September, half the days in this month has been off limits to the people of Cincinnati because of events that either require ticket purchases ranging from $30 to $395, or because of corporate events like that today. So the money that would be generated by this tax will be used to build things like the marina at Smale Park. Unless you own a boat, your $2 million worth of tax money is not creating a facility that's accessible to you. So this is something that's going on time and time again. So I say we need to preserve our parks and improve them and maintain them. And this project, this tax doesn't maintain, it doesn't correct the problems with the lack of maintenance of the park roads. It doesn't correct the problem with maintenance of the restrooms or the park shelters. It builds new things, many of which have nothing to do with parks. But the few things that are in parks, they're not fixing the parks. They're actually damaging the parks. So that's why we'd urge you to vote no. And we have passed around copies of Ms. Spencer's editorial. If you haven't got one, I have another copies, more copies. And we have copies of the actual